I became interested in this concept of identity formation through religious conversions many, many years ago, but particularly in light of the media recognition of Islam and Christianity and the post-events of 9/11. I saw a lot of information out there about particular religion leading to radicalism, concern of America's prisons being used as beds for conversion. And so I started doing my literature research, and I said, I just really can't find anything that's definitive. I find a lot of information out there that is coming from politicalized arguments. I see a lot of mythical, potentially mythical concepts arising as to particular classification of given religions as being radical versus non-radical, pro-social. So I said, I'd like to do some research on my own. And what better group to do so than an underrepresented group? So that led me also to prisons. I teach criminal justice, and I actually had worked in a prison for several years when I was an undergraduate and in graduate school also. And so I said, I really want to look at conversion in the prison setting, and I want to investigate this information I'm getting that there's huge numbers of individuals that are converting to Islam in prison. And I want to look at these politicalized arguments that say that somehow when you convert to a particular religion, we can have some sort of an indicator that that's going to lead you down some sort of a radical pathway. I said, I just don't see the evidence. So it took me quite a while to get a prison that would allow me to come in and interview inmates. So if anyone has ever tried to interview in-depth, deep meaning type qualitative research within a prison setting, you can understand what I'm saying. Thought I was going into Texas, and literally 2 weeks before, they got sued by another group, and they said, hey, no, you're not coming in. So if I hadn't known a very good friend in another prison system who was over research and development and had also been their senior chaplain for over their chaplaincy for like 20 years, I probably wouldn't have gotten in to do this particular research at the time that I did. But gatekeepers are important, especially to network and get to know those people. So there were the two rationales, succinctly put. One being the academic call and looking at how transformation in prison among prisoners may lead them down a more pro-social outcome, a change in identity by which when they are released we could reduce recidivism and lead them down a pathway of desistance. And then the other one was a societal call, which, based upon news reports and fear that's going around in the world about terrorism, a very real thing, something that we do need to research, something we do need to have information on, was to address and try to come up with some sort of a model that would allow me to take some concepts and eventually reduce those to some scales and some variables that then I could maybe go back into a prison and get a test bed that then we could give quantitative type tool measures so that we could begin measuring some sort of outcomes among these converts to both to Islam and Christianity. And so when I was naturally gravitating towards Islam because of the news reports, I said, what better religion to compare in America would be Christianity. So I limited my pilot test, and this was a very small number. I wound up with 22 prisoners, inmates, and 22 prison chaplains. And again, this was not meant to generalize. This was simply meant to try to reduce down and come up with some concepts that then I could reduce to some variables that I could measure with the goal of going back and doing some sort of quantitative analysis. So I broke down 3 generalized research questions: the social and personal reasons for a conversion. Why do prisoners, inmates, seek to convert? Are they really using it for a management tool to make life a little better, to get protection? Or is there something really happening within them that's driving them to try to change something about their life? 2, deals with their religious community. Are they inclusive or exclusive? In other words, in that conversion process, and as they become involved with other individuals and develop an identity within a community as well as within their self, are they more inclusive to other religious groups? In other words, come into our midst. Are they very exclusive to our... Now, I didn't look at pluralities. Right? I just tried to keep this simple. And then third was to look at the incorporationist or rejectionist identity, which deals with, regardless of whether I'm inclusive or exclusive in my religion, how do I approach my relationship with the secular world? Can I more or less walk in the world, be my religion, walk in the world, and that religion be separate from my religious community? Or am I so close to my religious community that every step I take in the secular world, I must also be trying to convey that and impress that upon the secular world themselves? Okay, so we've got these four dimensions there that emerge in identity. Sorry, this is not showing up any better, but let me tell you a little bit about my process. I had open-ended questions. Interviews with inmates lasted normally 2 to 2.5 hours each. So I had a multitude of material to work through. And as I initially started doing my coding, I started noticing that they were talking about their religious community, their relationships. They were talking about how they viewed the world about them. They were talking about themselves and their needs, which is self. And then somewhere in the midst of this, they talked heavily about the conversion process, this transformation. And they talked about it, and all but one individual talked about conversion in terms of transformation. There's something happening that's making me an altogether different person. Okay? So those were some initial points that coded out. Now, to kind of cut through some of the material, and then I'll show you a couple of tables. Interesting enough, exclusivist religious outlook. Now again, that's the religious community identity, right? Exclusive religious outlook did not necessarily lead to a rejectionist worldview. In other words, they were able to walk in the world and still be very religious in terms of their religious community. They could deal, if we want to put it in today's terms for us here, we could watch the most filthy, terrible program on television and still go to church the next Sunday morning. Okay, now that's pretty graphic. But they could take the secular world, they could walk in it, and they also have their religious world. Okay? So, not necessarily because they were very exclusive and saying our religion is the only way, was controlling as to whether or not they would actually get out and walk in community and be friends with all of us, irregardless of our religion. They might disdain us, but they would still find a way to be in the world with us. Exclusivists found a way to be in the world, right? Not of the world. In other words, they kept their beliefs, but they could still find ways to do the mechanical things of daily life that causes us to come into contact with other groups. And then rarely were the tendencies of the kind that would alert security. What I mean there is, and that's kind of a culmination of those above, I may be very religious, I may be very exclusive, I may find that my religion is the only way to the truth of the divine, but I'm not out there telling people if you don't follow my way, then you're bound for hell. Okay, that's what I'm getting at that point. So I found this to be true of the overall 22 individuals, okay, the participants in this study. So exclusivist undertones were detected in most of the narratives, whether they were Christian, whether they were Islam. Okay? Most were exclusive. Comparing Islam and Christian converts, despite the media reports that we're getting, of course, there's been lots of those. We've had lots of Senate hearings. There is a concern, but it doesn't seem to be, from my study, from this localized group of participants, that it's something that's rampant, at least in the prison system that I was at. Now again, I cannot generalize that until we have some more data. More Muslims coded inclusive, right, in their religious community, and incorporationist, in other words, walking in the world with other people, than the Christians in this particular participant group. Again, I didn't ask them direct questions, right? I asked them open-ended questions, and then I had to listen to what they were telling me. Of course, if I had asked them, are you inclusive, but are you also very willing to walk in the world, they would have probably said yes. But I didn't ask them that. I wrote red in between. All right. Distribution only of religious community identity by Islamic conversion, Christian conversion. Okay. What stands out there? If you look at exclusive, Muslims, 6, Christians, 9. Better number coded out exclusive in Christianity. That surprised me. I really didn't expect to find that. But I reported it that way because that's what I found. When we're talking about inclusive, Muslim, 5, Christian, 2. Okay. Again, 22 in, all reported. Looking at religious community and secular community, pairing those together. Inclusive incorporationist for Islam, 4, compared to Christian inclusive, 1. Muslim exclusive, 5. Christian exclusive, 8. The ones across the bottom, rejectionist. When I saw all of this data started to come out, and I coded this thing, and I set it down, and I coded it again. I spent months on the coding. And I kept coming up with 4 people that were very rejecting of society. And some were inclusive of their religion, some were exclusive. And there was a representative in each category for a follower of Islam and a follower of Christianity. I said, I cannot, there's no way I can show a bell curve on this and plat it out, but I just want to do it, so I did all this, right? I ran it out. Of all the converts, most of them fell in the middle. To the ends, I had 2 on each side. Far extremes. One was Islam, one was Christian, right, on each end. Or 2 on each end. And of those, one was rejectionist, exclusive, inclusive, rejectionist, exclusive, inclusive. And I looked at those 4 individuals. I went back and I read through their transcripts time and time again. And the ones that were exclusive hinged on, and rejecting, hinged on the fact that there was either, in the case of one individual who happened to also be African American, it was cultural and based on religious understandings that he somehow tied to his religious text. In other words, he pulled text and compared it to very political, very racially background, cultural type dimensions to explain his rejecting of society. And the other individual happened to be a white person, Christian in that case. The black fellow was Muslim. Christian was a white fellow, rejecting of society. He tied all of his discussion as to the rejecting of society to politics. Of those that were inclusive, they talked more in terms strictly of the pure text. They talked about love your neighbor, treat your neighbor as you would want to be, etc., etc. And they spoke a lot of spirituality. And we won't get into that today. I'll try to say just the religious side, but that was a major dimension that came out, and I heard spirituality. They talked about faith some, but they talked more on spirituality versus religion. All right. So I looked at this and I said, how is this going on? Of course, prison is places to strain, right? Prisonization, trying to get used to the situation. They started with strain, and we won't go through all of these different dialogues, but there was strain, it may have been tension, knowledge of self, stigma, labels, prisonization. There's even labels right in prison. Right? Prisoners have levels of hierarchy. Desire. Something had to happen that they wanted to make some sort of change. Now, 2 types of change. They wanted to manage the system, and I tried to code those out early in early interviews and then reduce these 22 down to the one that said, hey, there's something in me that's got to change. In other words, I'm not trying to change the system, I'm trying to change me to make life better. So that was desire, and they were looking for relationships, again, community. They were looking for personal understanding, knowledge of the world, knowledge of the divine, knowledge of the future, explain the unknown, how to get along in the world. They all talked about helpers. Somewhere along the line, they ran into a helper. And that's the word they used. Every one of them talked about a helper. A helper was integral. And guess what? It was not the chaplaincy that was the main helper. Because they all described the chaplaincy as great people, but they were all there as bureaucracy. Right? They were handling the paperwork. They were doing what the state and the government wanted them to do. And so helpers, by the way, happen to be either volunteers that came in from the world, which is a big point that comes out of this. We need more volunteers in the clergy and just lay people in prison chaplaincy going into prisons. Because they relied heavily on them when they had them. But guess what? When they didn't have them, cellmates. Right? Cellmates not necessarily are well versed in the scriptures to begin with, right? And they may also be carrying their own political, cultural biases. And so they may be teaching those distorted texts of whatever religion it is they're teaching to promote something that they want to achieve. So helpers were very important. And then that led to transformation, which never ends. But one of the great things about helpers is they motivated the person to stay on track. They instilled the commitment to do what they were supposed to do, even though it might hurt themselves. That it might not be a pleasant experience to, for example, bear your cross. Right? They taught, they inspired, they pressured when needed, they corrected when needed. In other words, they held them accountable. And these guys talked time and time and time again about the need for accountability. And then accountability came from your community, and that helped you change your identity. Okay? To become something other than antisocial, which you are, to seek to be something more pro-social. And that's never ending, and it keeps going. And every one of them said, I did this before in prison, and they released me, but somehow the system didn't help me continue this relationship when I got into the free world. So this has led to a new level of research that I'm going back through again in these narratives because I missed it the first time. But they were also telling me what went wrong for a lot of them when they had been released. And they fell right back into the old group. They went right back to their old identity. They went right back to their old community. Because we all need people. We all need somebody to talk with. We need someone to bear loads with. And for long, when they went back to the other people they were with before, guess what? Even if they hadn't done something, the police identified them as having done something on suspicion and pulled them in for investigation. And then, of course, wagging tongues, you hear old so-and-so got picked up again. Right? So that didn't do anything good. If they were trying to get into some sort of religious community, then people there might look at them a little, So they talked about those things. So that's a new level of research I'm going with on this, but I just thought I'd throw it in. Findings. Conversion in both groups is very nuanced. So many different things. It's hard to nail down anything particular. But I came out with about 7 different particular variables that I do want to I'm right now working on scales to try to measure the level of that intensity in those variables. Both groups, converts to either religion, in my participants, had many forks in the roads that they met. A major fork was that point of bottoming out. When did that strain attach? And they said they had to have something happen. Another fork was the desire. Is that desire for me to change, or is it the desire for me to change the system so I can continue to be like I am? Right? Another fork was then what helper they ran into. The helper could have preceded the desire. Right? They could have, in some instances, they were contacted by helpers that led them towards the desire. But most of them had the desire and then they met up with someone. So there were lots of different helpers that they described. Some that were more radical, some that were more conservative, some more pro-social, some more anti-social. So when you're looking at these inclusive and exclusive as well as the rejecting and incorporationist forks, there's lots of ways they can turn. And what most of it turned on was the need for somebody there for guidance and to hold them accountable. Right? You come back to that helper again. Which then comes back to the fact that we need lots of volunteers that are well trained to go into prisons to work with these people, because chaplains can't do it. Every chaplain told me, hey, I cannot counsel people. All I can do is try to find somebody that'll come in and represent that religion so that they're not being denied free access to that religion under the constitutional guidelines. They said, our time's full. We cannot do that. Okay, that's the end of it right there. There was one more, but that's basically the summary, guys. So I appreciate it, and